ethereal building block of life, basis for all magics, and be it condensed or in flow, beauty beyond compare. Aether is perhaps the most fundamental thing of import to understand when it comes to the comprehension of not only life and sentience on Hydaelyn, but all of the stars in the sky. Aether is the most basic constituent component of life and matter, its many different expressions making up all physical substances, and permeating all beings, flora, fauna, and even within and around the very star itself. Both able to be corporeal and incorporeal, it is the spark which grants life and form to the lifeless, be it in the body of man or in the cold stone of a soulkin. Conversely, death can be said to occur once Aether has left a corporeal object. It is because of this that the words life and Aether are often used interchangeably, though what one may constitute as life or sentience is a nebulous notion, despite it being derived from Aether in its varied attunements and forms. Aetherology, then, is the study in one sense of all things, but specifically the many expressions, aspectings, attunements, and dispositions of Aether in the world. Much like matter has states, so too does Aether. When it comes to this star, it is derived, or more accurately sourced, from the figurative beating heart at the core of the planet, the ethereal sea, the resting place of the Mother Crystal and Hydaelyn herself. It is a life stream, ever flowing and shifting throughout peoples and places, ever changing with the cycles of life and death, passing into new life and out of the old. It is not this star alone, though, that houses Aether, and it can be found all throughout the known universe, though it is thin in the empty void of the black space between the stars themselves. How then can a single substance result in all of existence? One might liken Aether to sound. As you adjust its frequency, you change its characteristics, and as you combine different reverberations, you end up with products far more complex than what seemed possible, like how we create intricate music from simple notes. While Aether is used as a term to refer to all its many varied forms and attunements, there are in actuality 6 elemental aspects and 2 polarities that Aether and its resulting physical forms may be attuned to: fire, wind, lightning, water, ice, and earth. These elements exist in greater or lesser proportions to each other, and while in balance, result in what may be described as unaspected Aether, or Aether as it's generally thought of, the imagery of which is most commonly associated with a neutral light blue hue, in both its ambient form and in crystals. These 6 elements and 2 polarities result in the natural world's functions and the myriad differences and dispositions of everything that is known. For example, arid regions like the Sogoli Desert and Thanalin, where ethereal currents of the land are aspected towards fire, will generally be hotter and drier than a region like the frigid north of Ilsabard, featuring primarily ice-aspected currents. The same can be said for the flora and fauna that populate those areas. For instance, a scalekin that is aspected towards wind can navigate the skies as if they were winged, as seen with the Sanua of the Sea of Clouds, and a scalekin aspected towards earth will exhibit adamantine skin. These ethereal currents that wind throughout the land carry the flow of the ethereal sea throughout the star, manifesting in points of greater or lesser confluences. Those of the strongest confluence may act as locations of great wellsprings of Aether, but are also places of vulnerability, where disruption might cause wild shifts in the environment. These confluences may change over time naturally, or be forcibly shifted through great upheaval, as is seen in the once verdant valleys of Kurthus, now an icen and chilled shadow of its former self, due to the disruption of the ethereal currents caused by Dalamud's fall, and the subsequent release of Aether by Bahamut at the Cartnau Flats. Of the 2 polarities, there is the astral, the pole of change, and the umbral, the pole of passivity. Aether in any form may exhibit both an elemental alignment and a polar attunement, resulting in a myriad forms of energy. For instance, a torrential river might be said to be astrally aligned, while still pool would be umbrally aligned. Life itself can experience these polar differences as well, with extreme cases resulting in a breadth of negative outcomes. Each of the poles houses 3 of the 6 elements, which are most prone to be tuned in that direction, though they are not limited to being so, with those of wind, lightning, and fire being associated with astral and change, and water, earth, and ice being predisposed towards the umbral and stasis. But where then do light and darkness fall into this equation? The two each are representations of the same polarities as astral and umbral, with darkness representing a combination of the colors of life and the tumultuous movement of the world, tying it to the astral alignment and change, while light, with its purity devoid of color and change, is tied to the umbral alignment and passivity, an excess of either being dangerous, as too much light would bring about the stilling of Aether, to the point that it did not flow at all, or an excess flood of darkness and change would be so chaotic that life itself could not flourish, and the very Aether would rend itself apart and consume all around it. Broadly, Aether may be split up into 2 camps: the corporeal, that which can be seen and touched, and the incorporeal, which we cannot see without aid, though we can interact with it, of which each can be broken down into many different expressions of Aether. In example, the soul and memory are 2 distinct representations of incorporeal Aether, while the body would be an example of corporeal Aether. The simplest way to denote the two is their tangibility, but one should be careful in assigning a broad spectrum of characteristics to a single category. As though magic is corporeal, one would not say it is the same as food, and in like, one should not treat all forms of incorporeal Aether as the same. But since there is a discernible physical world and etheric world, where then is the dividing line and source of the two? Existence of any and all things occurs on 2 separate but overlapping planes: the corporeal realm of physical things and the ethereal realm, a churning expanse without substance, but containing the essence of all creation. Though its name bears that of Aether, it is perhaps possible that such a realm in fact contains more kinds of energies that are intangible to the corporeal world that as yet are unknown to us. When something in the corporeal realm dies or is destroyed, the Aether permeating its body passes back into the flow of the ethereal realm, and when something new is created or born in the corporeal realm, it is formed of and granted life by Aether, regardless of where it be drawn from. When a body eats and drinks, it replenishes its Aether. When it exerts itself, it spends it. A natural balance is maintained between the 2 worlds. Each plane exerts influence on the other, the proximity of the 2 determining the scope of that influence. The further one dives into the heart of the star, the more the lines between the 2 blur. Though if one's physical body enters through this method of manual descension, they may perhaps be able to retain their physical form, but none can say for how long before they're broken down into their constituent parts, as since the corporeal form and soul is merely made up of Aether, prolonged existence in the sea's ever-shifting currents will seek to convert all within back to its flow. Even in places on the surface of our world, there can be variances in proximity to the ethereal sea, which exerts its influence upon them. Such places on the physical plane may benefit from this proximity by becoming rich in ambient Aether, something which promotes growth and life and the creation of crystals. Ambient Aether is just that, ambient. It is the incorporeal Aether that permeates the movements of nature, while remaining as intangible as the ethereal sea, existing in channels and interconnecting the world like currents of the sea and air. Despite its incorporeal nature, it can be drawn upon for use and be given form through that use. Though it may be thin and uncondensed, it is a potent supply from which many spellcasters draw their etheric stores, though not limitlessly or without repercussions, and it can be sensed and felt by those who have sensitivities to its flow and density. Conversely, locations where there is distance between the physical and ethereal realms, or a lack of Aether through misuse, are thought to suffer from harsh and barren climates, and are characteristically void of life. If for some reason, one plane were to become irreparably damaged, the other would also suffer, leading to the eventual collapse of both, as we see in the fate of the Void, a world so attuned astrally and to darkness that its world became irreparably damaged. With the ambient aether of nature being consumed and removed, a chain cascade began as the lands and peoples all suffered a fate of destruction or corruption. In contrast to ambient aether of the world, then, is the aether that makes up the physical things, plants, objects, and even exists in condensed forms in what we know as crystals. When an entity imbued with aether dies, the subsequent release of aether will return to the ethereal sea, or into the ambient aether of the world itself. However, when a being permeated by aether suffers grievous injury, or something causes an extreme amount of aether to be released all at once into the world, crystals form. The aether of crystals may be balanced, creating regular crystals with no charge, that can be used as simple potent stores of aether. Or, the strongest aspected part of the released aether may remain in the world, and manifest in a physical form known as elemental crystals, such as earth or wind crystals. As with the expulsion of aether violently from bodies, this can also happen when the very land is rent, be it by war or other causes, and the very lifeblood of the star bleeds out for a time, resulting in crystal deposits. The aspect of these crystals being tied to the aether of its source. Crystals can have a myriad of uses, being highly concentrated and portable sources of aether. Those without elemental charge have many general applications, while those of elemental aspect have specific uses, like lightning crystals powering devices, air crystals used to help lift airships, and fire crystals to light and maintain forges for smithies. However, despite their incredible usefulness, crystals are dangerous and can be the source of weapons, such as fire crystals being used in firearms, or even in a raw state as incendiary components. It's then no surprise that the consumption of a crystal would be a near suicidal prospect, as it would upend the ethereal balance of an organism, and result in their likely death. If a crystal's charge to a specific element becomes too great, it can become over-aspected, or what we refer to as corrupted crystals. Sickeningly orange-hued crystals found throughout the land that exhibit such a dearth of elemental energy and charge that to even be near one is a dangerous proposition, as the elemental energies seek to twist and change the aether around it towards its own aspect, as well as the inherent dangers of its attuned element. When the land was grievously wounded by the fall of Dalamud and the hellfires of Bahamut, as well as the sheer dearth of energy returned to the land upon his defeat, the outpouring of the land's aether resulted not only in large crystal formations, but also highly over-aspected ones. While this is informed conjecture, this also may have been a byproduct of the nature of the seventh umbral calamity, which was one of astrality, excessive growth and change causing the rampant energies we see in the corrupted crystals. When it comes to bodies, the etheric volume a being has access to depends on a number of factors. Not least among them is the physical frame of the being in question. An old man will likely have a less ready reservoir of aether compared to a young one, and a large beastkin will tend to house much larger raw stores than a small one. Beyond this physical component, though, is the soul of an individual. A notion that is hard to fully pin down in its entirety, but exists demonstrably. The soul is the spark of life within a living being, a dense core of aether with its own color and disposition, that if one was to be without, would render them no more than an empty, though still technically living, vessel. While it is common to see the soul as the self, the identity and consciousness, it is only one half of that equation. Separate from the soul are memories, which can be born upon and through the aether of people and the land, and leave indelible grooves in the soul. But memories are not in and of themselves needed for being alive, or to begin to have an identity. As for the origin of the soul, there are two popular schools of thought. One is that when a soul returns to the ethereal sea, it is cleansed but kept whole, eventually brought back to the living world and given new life and new form. Others suggest that all souls break down when returned to the life stream, and their aether mixes and melds, forming new souls. I am of the opinion that both schools are likely correct, and both circumstances are possible outcomes. The Aether of the soul in life, though, is rarely subject to dramatic change, and memory is tied to the soul, as the two are intrinsically linked. Memory is just that, those recollections we have of events and places, deeds and faces. Such things are born in Aether, and we house them within ourselves. Moments of extreme import or change can even be carved into one's soul, such that even if the memory is gone, the place it has left behind is an imprint of the very experience itself. Imagine the soul as paper, and memories as words written upon it in ink. Imagine you doused the soul in Aether, the same type as makes up memories. In this analogy, it would be like dousing the paper with ink. The words are technically still there, but no longer legible. And in like, memories would be unable to be recalled, and anything tied to them hindered, be it sentiments or skills. We will talk about this phenomena later on in regards to the Seventh Umbral Calamity. Ostensibly, such a principle could be used intentionally to affect or bind one's memory, but such a technique would run against most, if not all, known morality. Soul crystals, those stones which help heroes and adventurers gain skills and abilities, work under the same principle of memory, housing the ethereal memory of those who held on to them, in order to help impart the memory of their techniques onto those who take up the soul crystal after. This is in part why a certain baseline of understanding is required to use a soul crystal, as one could make little sense of a text written in another language, much less a torrent of memory of foreign ideas and arts. Another seeming expression of memory is a mysterious power in some individuals known as the echo, which allows for the tapping into of etheric memory currents. Both those memories of people and those of the land, which are more faint but still present. This gift is tied to many other special skills, and seems to awaken in individual peoples only upon witnessing certain phenomena, perhaps tying the recollection of some far-flung event engraved into our souls to the awakening of skills and powers that are lost to us. Beyond these two concepts of soul and memory is what one might call the spirit or will, parts of sentient experience that are not fully explained by the two aspects of soul and memory. When it comes to these, there are phenomena beyond the ken of our understanding of Aether, such as the breaking of limits that leave scholars puzzled to the exact scope of Aether's effects. Perhaps we can look to the views of others, such as the Hanish alchemists of Razat Han, and their belief in the emotional energies of the universe that cannot be manipulated or controlled, which they call Akasha, for some guidance. However, virtually no academic study seems to exist on the topic in current days, perhaps due to the inherent lack of quantifiability of such things. There is much and more to say on the nature of soul, body, and mind, but that is a discussion for another day, as what we do and do not know is legion. Magic, then, is perhaps one of Aether's most famed and notable forms. Corporeal in its manifestation, magic is most simply the manipulation of Aether, channeling it from its natural state, be it ambient or condensed, into tangible effects on the world, such as healing with light and water, or to destroy with flame and lightning, and everything in between and beyond. Many different schools of thought and philosophy exist around this core premise, not least of which is the arts of Eorzean conjury and thaumaturgy. Often, even similar philosophies will exhibit wide gulfs in their application, such as with Charlian astrology and Othardian geomancy. When it comes to the use of magics, there are two possible sources of Aether, that which comes from without the user, and that which comes from within. From without, you have spellweavers like the Black Mage, who draws ambient Aether from the outside, and condenses it in order to weave great balls of flame and the like. From within, you have schools like the Red Mage, who uses the smaller reservoirs of Aether from within themselves, but through use of a catalyst and techniques, concentrates that Aether in order to reap similar effects. Why then not always draw upon the Aether from without, if it's a larger pool from which to cast magic? Firstly, the stores of Aether from without are vast, but there are consequences to reckless use, bringing damage to life and the land by the theft of its Aether. Look no further than at the fate of the Burn of Othard, or the consequences of the War of the Magi that brought about the Sixth Umbral Calamity. Secondly, an area may not be replete in Aether, and so the self is a much more consistent source from which to draw such energy. And finally, the abundance of ambient Aether is such that a lack of diligent control of its channeling into oneself is often likely to end in the user's self-immolation or other dreadful effects. The manipulation of chakra by monks is one method of ethereal control from within, allowing for the control of one's ethereal flow throughout their body and enabling great bodily feats rather than arcane spells, using the ambient Aether of the land and battle sites to open up these chakra. And extreme cases of pulling on Aether from without can be seen in the Astrologian, pulling it from the very stars of the heavens. Diving into the many kinds and methods of magic is more than a few lessons of its own. There are many expressions of ethereal manipulation, like the lost elegant art of etherochemistry. Similar to the nuanced techniques of magic users is the more primitive ethereal manipulation of creatures of the star. Scalekin, who can breathe fire, or Wavekin, able to blast jets of water and the like, are some expressions, and all of which function under the same general premise of elemental ethereal manipulation. One common form of magic we see in daily use is the magic to teleport across great distances. As covered in a prior entry, teleportation is the act of breaking one's form down into pure Aether and traversing the etheric sea by means of using Aetherite as beacons or lighthouses to guide oneself to. Doing so, much like other spells, takes focus, preparation, and control, and the act of converting oneself to Aether and haphazardly throwing themselves into the ethereal sea is most like to result in the caster being lost in the sea, as their body's Aether slowly breaks down and rejoins the life stream. Connected with Aether and transportation is the usage of Aether and aspected crystals to treat goods and machines in order to improve their use. This can manifest in the ethereal treatment of airship sails with wind Aether to improve lift and flight, or blades and armor with earth Aether to improve their durability. Within the world of magic and material exist interesting beings and creations that are yet one more expression of Aether's ability to create life. Soulkin, as touched on in our primer on creatures of Hydaelyn, are inorganic beings that have been granted temporary life through magic or other ensorcelled medium. That magic allows for Aether to gather within them, allowing for movement, simple cognition, and locution. They can come in all manner of forms, as the physical object from which they are created can be crafted in near any likeness, and their longevity can be seen in the creations of Amdapor and Belladia, whose soulkin still draw Aether into themselves, and function well over a millennia after each nation has fallen. Elementals are, in a way, on the other end of the spectrum, as naturally occurring beings of pure Aether. Though such a thing may seem odd, if one is to consider that Aether itself is what can constitute the soul, memory, and more, then seeing such things made physical in manifestation when Aether is sufficiently condensed is not all that surprising, though still remarkable. Those elementals of the world often show no sentience, but there are those who do, such as the elementals of the Twelveswood and the Fairy of the Scholar, the latter of which is made manifest through the condensation of the scholar's own Aether through the lens of their soul crystal. Ghosts, too, are examples of corporeal Aether left over from the souls and bodies of those who have passed. Sufficient enough emotion and lingering will, mixed with the Aether of the body, and leave these shades behind. If they are merely an imprint of the individual, or in some cases actual manifestations of their souls, is not always clear, and the function by which will and emotion allows them to linger on implies a force beyond Aether acting upon them, though this is merely conjecture. Like fairies, and between elementals and soulkin, is the carbuncle. Using geometric symbols as channels of etheric manipulation, and gemstones, which are then infused with Aether, an arcanist might bring forth a carbuncle, a familiar that's personality and appearance is based in the gem used to summon it. In like are the Parago, common toads which through magic have been given speech and cognition, though as these magics fade, do the Parago revert back to their original state, and thus it is the Aether and abilities of the caster given form more than the toad having its own faculties elevated, further demonstrating the ways in which Aether carries not only physical characteristics of energy, but those of memory and sentience as well. Separate to the concept of elemental familiars is the idea of manufactured souls, or anima. The fundamental idea of condensing Aether into a mass of sufficient density to result in a soul is, in a sense, simple, but in practice much more difficult, as Aether will quickly attempt to dissipate down to a more normal equilibrium. Using a catalyst, like a soul crystal to store large sums of Aether of specific attunements, and various methods to seal that Aether from dissipating into the surrounding environment, one may conceivably create a manufactured soul of sufficient density. But what such a new life might be like, or if it is functionally indistinguishable from a conventional soul, is as yet unclear. There are those creatures of the Far East, like the Kami and Auspice, whose existence exemplifies a few things. Beings that were once regular animals who ascended to a form of godhood by living long enough to accrue intelligence and power. Through this, the Auspice prove an underlying principle of Aether, that due to the nature of memory and the soul, near any creature who lives sufficiently long enough can likely gain sentience. A strange but key factor that differentiates Auspices is that they are seemingly singular to Othard in terms of the raw power which they possess, with other known examples of longevity leading to intelligence providing no such boon to lifespan or material powers. Which begs the question, what about Othard or its Aether would allow for such beings? The prevailing theory being faith in the Auspices themselves. If perhaps stories beget faith, and faith begets tangible impacts on Aether and magics of creation, it is no wonder such creatures could come to be, with the simple but deep piety of those of the Far East. Once more though, this is conjecture, and perhaps a matter for another time. Speaking of elementals, auspices, faith, and other creations of Aether, we should also cover primals. Primals, or icons as they are known by the Garleans and ancient Allag, are beings made of Aether and faith. The Aether being drawn from any sufficiently dense source, be it crystal, etheric medium, or even grimly, the bodies of the living. The requisite Aether, mixed with the beliefs and faith of the summoners, gives the Aether form, in a type of magic known as creation magics. The famed ability to temper that primals have, instilling in their victim an unwavering loyalty to the primal, is in fact an affliction of the soul and memory. The primal uses their power to attune an individual's soul towards their own elemental alignment and disposition, affecting their memories as well, resulting in a breaking of self. Prolonged exposure and repeated treatments of tempering can even begin to affect not only the soul, but the body, breaking a person down and converting their physical form into something more aligned with the disposition of the tempering primal. Faith, while not able to fuel a primal in and of itself, is a major component, as seen with all of the primals of the beast tribes, and just as importantly, with the faith of the people of Eorzean, who summoned a primal of the 12 in their hour of need above Cartnow, despite their lack of awareness to this reality. Faith then has tangible effects on Aether, though the full scope of why and how is as yet not entirely clear, though demonstrable. Primals glean more Aether and strength from the ambient Aether of the land, slowly draining the currents around them of their lifeblood. This can be seen most tragically in the Burn, a blasted, aetherless waste that had its Aether leached away by existent primals and repeated summonings of primals. These manifestations are dangerous in and of their own right, devouring the land's Aether, but also because they can shift the balance of the stars towards a disposition, be it elemental or polar, which can result in the Calamities. The Umbral Calamities are events of extreme upheaval in the history of this star. As of yet, there have been 7. In order, they were a calamity of wind, lightning, fire, earth, ice, water, and the final and most recent being a calamity of astral alignment. Each calamity ends in Astral Era and proceeds in Umbral Era, save for the first, which ended prehistory. Each calamity has been marked by an extreme event of its associated element that left the world's populace decimated. Examples being the 4th Umbral Calamity, where worldwide earthquakes ended the vaunted empire of Allag, or the 6th Umbral Calamity, a worldwide flood that drowned most of the known world. The elemental associations of each calamity is not random, and one can assume an 8th Umbral Calamity would be one of Umbral, if the pattern continues. What might a ninth calamity entail is unknown, be it the cycle beginning anew or some worse fate. Whether it be by intention or accident, as the elemental polarities of the source tilt in one direction, be it elementally or to either of the poles, the Aether becomes more and more aligned in that direction, until at some precarious moment, the levee breaks and a tidal wave of associated elemental charge floods forth. If we look to the 7th Umbral Calamity, with the fall of Dalamud and Bahamut, the resulting chaos, change, and the very upheaval of the land, as well as the over-aspecting of crystals, is connected with the nature of Astral. The Aether that flooded into the land acted as a boon in some ways, as life began to flourish, but epochs in others, as an excess of Aether that was astrally charged, likely due to Bahamut, made aspects of nature run out of control. And due to the nature of memory, the overriding flood of Aether returning to the land upon the defeat of Bahamut resulted in much of the period after becoming hazy and vague for those who experienced it, as the Aether of renewal is undiscerning. Other catastrophic events can cause more localized changes, like the Battle of Silvertear Sky, resulting in the land of Mordona experiencing such an outpouring of Aether that the excess resulted in the crystallization of the entire region. It is from this that we should remember, all things in excess bode ill for life, even Aether. Aether can be attuned so far in one direction, it becomes, as far as we are aware, irrevocably shifted, and a knock-on effect is created. As implied throughout this lecture, the most widely known example of this being the 13th reflection of Hydaelyn, more commonly known as the Void, which through Ascian machinations had its balance tilted towards darkness and the astral, to the point that not only was the shard devastated, it was permanently so, with all life and Aether being thrown out of balance and twisted towards astrality and chaos, resulting in those beings of Aether having their forms twisted and corrupted into what we know as Voidsent. It is supposition, but one can assume that the astral polarity of their Aether is the cause behind Voidsent's rampant desire to consume Aether, as their very form attempts to convert, change, and rend itself and the Aether around it apart. The Voidsent in reality are little different than those who have been corrupted by a primal's elemental tempering, while maintaining a twisted will and personality all their own, at least in those Voidsent of the higher rungs. And though no known way exists to reverse the physical effects on a being once their body has been twisted and changed due to etheric imbalancing, it is possible that a rebalancing of the Aether on the 13th, by some hitherto unknown method, might one day see the reflection of Hydaelyn restored to what it once was, and able to start anew. Aether is the cycle of life and death, the embodiment of us and our world, and the means by which we are. An understanding of it is very literally fundamental in all things, and I hope this lesson has helped to uncloud the confusion that often surrounds this most important of topics. And if not, then know that no matter how long we study, even the most adept of experts would acknowledge that there always are, and ever shall be, new frontiers of understanding to explore in all things. And perhaps with Aether and any other primordial energies of life, most of all. This content was brought to you by the Eorzean Archives. If you enjoyed this video, help us please the 12 by leaving a like and subscribing for new content every Thursday, and comment down below with any topic you'd like to see our archons cover in the future. For even more content, discussion, and exclusives, please check out our Discord and consider supporting us on Patreon.